Welcome back to another episode of the EV Life podcast. My name is Hannah Neal. I am sitting in for Crystal today, our host on this episode. And today we're going to be talking about EV tariffs. And some of you may have heard in the news in recent months that the government imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese imported EVs. And for many people, you might have no idea what that means. And so we decided to bring on an economist from UBC. His name is Sumeet Gulati, and he is an expert in this area. He knows a lot about just the economy of tariffs and how that impacts consumers. And so we're going to chat with him, and he's going to break down what the tariff is, why it was imposed, how it affects you, the consumer, the EV buyer, potential EV buyer. And hopefully this information is really helpful to you. If you have any thoughts or comments, we'd love to hear them in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app, and enjoy this episode. Hi, Sumi. Thanks so much for meeting us with us today.
Hello. Nice to meet you too.
So for our listeners, can you just get started tell us a little bit about yourself and the research and work that you do around international trade and the economics of urban transportation?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm Sumeet Gulati. I have a PhD in agricultural and resource economics. I'm currently the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. It's a small faculty that's mostly around issues of agriculture and environment. And I am in a part of the group in the faculty called Food and Resource Economics. So we study issues around the economics of environment. And so I got my PhD from Maryland, and I think for the first third of my career, which has been a long time now, I was studying international trade and the politics of international trade, especially international trade policy, things like tariffs and policies that supposedly are helping the environment, but sometimes also just helping domestic production. So that's where a lot of my research was. Then about the next third of my career, I studied urban transportation. So it's sort of mostly around automobiles, but also around congestion.
Okay.
Right. So it was. So my automobile work was largely around hybrids and recently on electric cars, but trying to see how subsidies given by governments or tax rebates by governments actually help increase sales or do not increase sales, or who gains and who loses from those sorts of subsidies. I know Alberta had none of those.
Yeah.
There was a full subsidy, but that's the only subsidy Albertans got.
Yeah, so that's something interesting that you pointed out. Yeah, so Alberta is one of the only provinces that doesn't have its own dedicated subsidy, but we are able to access the federal one. So so that's really
federal subsidies. I mean, so what ended up happening in my research often was I used Alberta as my counterfactual.
Okay.
Because it was one of the provinces that didn't have subsidies, right? So it was easy for me to at least say, well, if electric cars, generally people are using electric cars, how much more are they using BC relative to Alberta, for instance?
Interesting. That's very interesting. So you talked a little bit about the research you do around tariffs and policy when it comes to policies that the government implements in relation to vehicles. So recently, in the news earlier this year, the government imposed an EV tariff on Chinese EVs coming into Canada. So for our listeners who, have no idea what a tariff is, what this means for them, can you maybe break that down and explain what it is, and maybe if you have any insight into why the government imposed it?
So very simply, a tariff is just a tax, but a tax on goods that are imported. So if you say, I want to bring in in this case, the electric car, like a BYD from China, if you or someone else has been imported for you and then sell it to you, they have to pay a tax at the border, at the point of import. And so in this case, in Canada's case, it's 100% tariff. Mm-hmm. The car costs $20,000 or $30,000 in China. It's going to cost $60,000 after import. There's obviously going to be transportation charges bringing the cars in. Typically, they're produced from another country. There's a cost of transportation, but that's pretty standard. Lots of cars are imported across the world now. So I think the transportation cost is not prohibitive. certainly the tariff of 100% is prohibitive. So I think Canada imposed it in October, 100% tariff on all Chinese-made automobiles, or Chinese-made electric automobiles, not other automobiles, also on certain components of electric automobiles that are used in electric automobiles. There was up to 25 to 100% tariffs somewhere there.
Okay.
It says it's a 1 year trial tariff, and it'll be reviewed after a year. We'll see what happens after.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, if a vehicle, for example, costs $60,000, the tariff is $60,000.
At this point, it's 100%.
Okay.
So all electric vehicles have 100% tariff.
Okay, interesting. And so how does that affect, consumers and potential EV buyers?
Yeah, so maybe actually before we go back to that, so I think one of your questions was also about why, right? Why is the tariff right there? Why is this tariff there? And I don't think Canada had a choice. I think we think about this as, Canada put this tariff on, but actually the US government was the first mover in this game. They said we want to put a tariff on Chinese manufacturers. And the Canadian and the US automobile sectors are so tightly knit, right? We produce a lot of, in fact, like one of the big GM plants producing electric vehicles is in Ontario, right? So if the US does something in an automobile sector, we always do the same. Okay. So you can we know Canada's put the tariff, but frankly, we don't have a choice. If the US is going to continue this tariff from now on, a year later, we will continue it as well. Because our automobile sectors are highly tied. We cannot do anything differently from what the US economy would do there.
And does it also have to do with maybe like the Canadian labor market and helping to increase Canada's supply chain and build that up more? Is that
absolutely right? So the motive for this tariff probably in the US was to help domestic automobile manufacturers and people employed in domestic automobile production, right? So the US did that, and because any US like GM, Ford, etc., produce across the border, or sometimes Toyota produces in Canada for sale in the US, right? Because there's this sort of really free-flowing automobile parts and automobiles itself within Canada and the US. So it will help promote all tariffs. What the effect is, if you are producing a car that is more expensive than the BYD, you can still sell it. Otherwise, people will just part BYD.
Okay.
So once you impose a tariff, you allow those manufacturers at home who might be producing a car for more or car parts for more than the Chinese manufacturers were to still be able to sell their product because that will still buy because you don't have competition.
Right. Yeah, that competition kind of gets removed. So
the tariff will help Ford and GM and other manufacturers. It will help other people who produce. So Canada is also a big parts producer. Independently of what Ford and GM do, we produce a lot of the electric vehicle parts. I think the federal government put a lot of money into battery manufacturing plants in Canada. So those manufacturing plants will do better because of these tariffs.
Yeah. So how does it actually affect, the average consumer or EV owner, potential EV buyer?
Clearly, I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Now that you have, it's fairly clear now that right now, at least, the world's cheapest electric vehicles, at least decent quality electric vehicles, are made in China. We don't have access to them anymore. So a potential EV buyer will have to pay more for their EV than they would have otherwise.
Okay.
If they could buy the Chinese import. So that's the most obvious and the most immediate effect. The long-term effect may be if we do have a better electric vehicle, given that automobiles always have these huge downward, the so-called economies of scale. The more you produce, cheaper the cars get. So what this does is allows our domestic manufacturers to produce more cars because more people will buy them. And maybe they'll also become cheaper because of these downward reducing sort of cost curves as you produce more cars. So it's possible that in the long run, we'll have more choices of domestic cars.
Okay.
Than we would have had otherwise if we just let Chinese manufacturers come in, and that'll kill a lot of the domestic manufacturing of automobiles or of automobile parts. So it's potentially possible that this might work in the long run to give us more domestic choice.
Okay. And in the short term, do you think that it might affect the EV industry in a way that maybe less cars will be sold, more cars will be sitting on the lot for a period of time. How will it affect, let's say car dealerships, or we talked about manufacturers, how it affects them.
Relatively, EVs are just more expensive,
Yeah.
and they'll stay more expensive because the cheaper EV is not available.
Right.
So it's true. If you had a cheaper EV, maybe people would have bought more EVs. There'd be more diffusion of EVs. We have these limits, the Canadian government. I know in BC, we have a 2035, I believe it's 2035, that all new cars that have to be sold in BC have to be electric.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be hard to reach that
Right.
if we don't have cheaper EVs. Right?
Yeah, that's actually a Canada-wide mandate. Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of like mandate. So that is going to be much harder to reach if we don't have cheaper cars. So the hope is that some of these other manufacturers start producing things that are cheaper and that are buy it. But certainly, I don't know if the current cars will sit on the lot longer. They're just more expensive. They are more expensive. Yeah. I don't even know if there's a supply chain of BYD even established before this.
Okay.
Because we did, and that may have been, and sort of because also the supply chain in North America is quite controlled by the industry. It may have been something, an artifact of that. But at this point, we didn't have a supply chain. So I don't know if the current manufacturers are going to face they'll only be happier. The people selling EVs right now in Canada will be happier that Chinese competition will be kept out.
Is there anything else that you might want to share with listeners to help them, make informed decisions on, when it comes to how this tariff affects them or purchasing EVs?
Not really anything other than that. The fact that tariffs are now a big deal, right? We're hearing about the US imposing tariffs on Canada. Eventually, I think a lot of the world is saying we need to support our domestic industry and stop imports from the world. There's good and bad to it, like we just talked about, right? Things are going to get more expensive when you block cheaper people from producing it, but you might produce more of it at home. There's a concern that this might actually, the fact that you have free imports reduces employment at home. So that's entirely valid at points, right? At certain industries. We should just understand that's good and bad.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast today. This was really informational, and I know that our listeners will also benefit from this. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for talking to me.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the EV Life podcast. Make sure that you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you'd like to join the conversation, you can always do so in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. We'll talk to you in the next episode.